The sky above Burma in 1941 looked deceptively calm. Clouds drifted lazily, sunlight shimmered on the jungle canopy below, and the faint hum of engines seemed like nothing more than a distant storm. Yet inside that stillness lay the arrogance of a rising empire. Japanese pilots, trained, confident, and certain of their superiority, laughed at the American-built Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. To them, it was a clumsy beast, heavy on the wings, sluggish compared to their nimble Zero fighters. They mocked it as if it were a relic, a machine destined to fall apart the moment it tried to climb into combat. But war has a way of punishing overconfidence. Imagine yourself in the cockpit of one of those Japanese Zeros, the tropical air rushing past your canopy, the faint tang of gasoline mixing with the sweat on your gloves. You bank toward the bulky P-40 ahead, certain of an easy kill. You press the trigger, the chatter of your machine guns rattling the frame. Yet in the very next second, tracer fire slams back at you, thicker, louder, devastating. 6.50 caliber Browning M2S, spewing a storm of lead that cuts the sky open like a jagged scar. You flinch. The laugh dies in your throat. That clumsy Warhawk suddenly feels less like prey and more like a predator. From afar, the scene looks cinematic, arcs of tracer fire crisscrossing in the sunlight, smoke curling from shredded wings, the jungle below a silent witness to arrogance turned into disaster. Closer, you can almost hear the desperation, pilots shouting over radios, engines screaming in protest as they dive too hard, too late. And closest of all, in the trembling hands of the Japanese airmen who just moments ago sneered at the Warhawk, you sense despair. This was not supposed to happen. The Zero was supposed to dance gracefully in the air, untouchable. Yet here it was, being torn apart not by elegance but by raw, merciless firepower. This is not just a tale of machines clashing in the sky. It is the story of how hubris, unchecked, unquestioned, meets its reckoning. The P-40 Warhawk was no masterpiece of aerodynamics. It was not the fastest nor the most agile. But it was brutal, rugged, and armed to the teeth. It turned mockery into mourning, derision into defeat. And it taught Japan's finest pilots a bitter lesson, that laughter is a fragile shield when lead begins to rain. Stay with us as we uncover the real battles behind the myth, the dogfights that rewrote tactics, the engineering decisions that transformed a laughingstock into a weapon of fear, and the forgotten voices of pilots who lived through the chaos. If history fascinates you, if you want to experience not just the facts but the emotions, the sweat, the dread, and the triumph, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and join us for more untold war stories brought to life. Because the past is never just history, it is a living lesson etched in fire and steel. When the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk first appeared in the late 1930s, it was not greeted as a marvel but as a compromise. Its climb rate was unimpressive, its agility at high altitude limited, and in the hangars of Tokyo its silhouette drew smirks. Japanese pilots, already intoxicated by the light and lethal grace of the Zero, scoffed openly. They called it a clumsy dragon, heavy in the wings, sluggish in the climb, a beast of burden compared to their dancer in the sky. Laughter rolled through mess halls as they joked that American factories built coffins with wings. Yet war has a way of punishing contempt. December 1941 brought flames to Pearl Harbor and, days later, brought the Warhawk to Kunming. The morning sun broke through mist as Japanese bombers droned across Yunnan, their escorts wheeling confidently above. On the ground, civilians heard a deeper growl rising from the valley. Then the Warhawks appeared, shark teeth painted on their noses, their engines roaring like predators emerging from cloud. For an instant, the Japanese grinned at the audacity of decoration. Then 6 Brownings lit the sky. Tracers slashed into bomber formations, aluminum skins tore open, and sudden blossoms of fire tumbled earthward. Survivors wrote later of shock. The dragon they mocked did not stumble, it struck. The Warhawk did not wheel in playful circles. It dove like a falling hammer, hit with thunder, and climbed away before the Zero could turn. One Japanese airman scrawled in his diary that night, "Their guns are spears of lightning. I chased but could not catch. The clumsy dragon vanished and my commander burned." Through the bitter winter of 1941 into 1942, the pattern repeated. The Flying Tigers, Americans and borrowed skies became legends. Over Rangoon the air was heavy with humidity and the city shook with bombs. Sirens wailed as civilians looked up, and through the haze came the Warhawks. Burmese on the ground called them dragons, pointing at the shark mouths that tore into bomber streams. Above, Japanese escorts dove with arrogant certainty, expecting to carve the heavy machines apart. Yet again the Warhawks refused to dance. They slashed, they dove, they struck, and the Zero pilots who followed found their frames quivering, their controls heavy, their fuel igniting. In the wreckage of downed Zeros, investigators found bullet holes clustered like signatures, each burst a reminder that brute force can outmatch elegance. Reports began to shift in tone. Where once they ridiculed the Warhawk, now they carried warning. "Beware the dive," read one, "to follow the shark mouth is to die." But arrogance dies slowly. New pilots arrived at the front still laughing, convinced that earlier defeats were accidents. They spoke of the Zero's supremacy, of its legendary turn, of the fragility of American steel. Then they met the P-40 in the skies of Burma or China or over the jungles of Malaya, and the lesson repeated. A Zero turning too tight exploded when a Warhawk burst across its path. A bomber squadron that thought itself safe disintegrated under coordinated slashing attacks. The Warhawk had no poetry, but it wrote truth in fire. One American pilot said later, "We heard their laughter and we wanted them to. It gave us an edge." Every burst was payment for their pride. By the spring of 1942, the laughter had thinned. The Warhawk was no longer dismissed as a relic but spoken of as a threat. In Japan's own air group notes, the tone had changed. Pilots were instructed not to pursue in dives, not to assume weakness. Civilians in occupied territories told stories of shark-mouthed dragons that saved their fields. And though the Warhawk was still slower, still less agile, still mocked in comparison to other Allied types, it had carved a legend from contempt. The metamorphosis had begun, and the machine that once provoked sneers now carried shadows into the hearts of those who faced it. By mid-1942 the Warhawk had grown from an underdog into a familiar predator. Its reputation followed it wherever Allied squadrons took flight. In the deserts of North Africa, where sandstorms cut visibility and the sun burned into cockpits like a furnace, the British called it Tomahawk or Kitty Hawk, but the lesson was the same: underestimate it and die. German pilots had laughed too, muttering that it was an American export fit only for training, yet they quickly learned that in low-altitude battles the Warhawk was merciless. Diving into a formation of Stukas or slashing at a Messerschmitt, it showed the same brutal qualities that had stunned Japanese aces over Burma. Its nose did not turn with elegance, but its guns shredded anything caught in their path. What happened in the desert mattered to the Pacific because word traveled. Japanese officers, once convinced that their Zero was peerless, began reading reports of Warhawks downing German fighters. The clumsy dragon was now killing across continents, and whispers of unease reached the briefing rooms. Back in the jungles of New Guinea, the Warhawk returned with a vengeance. The Owen Stanley Mountains loomed like walls of cloud and rain, and Japanese units flew into this cauldron still trying to cling to arrogance. Young pilots arrived fresh from training, still believing the tales of Zero supremacy. They laughed at the shark teeth painted on Allied machines, muttering that no paint could cover poor design. But their laughter was short. In the brutal skies over Buna and La they discovered what veterans already knew, that to chase a Warhawk in a dive was suicide. Again and again the pattern repeated, the Warhawk screaming down from altitude, its guns carving glowing lines through the air, Zeros igniting before they could react. Diaries found after battles carried lines of despair. One pilot wrote, "The dragon comes fast and leaves faster. We cannot match its fall. To see its teeth is to see death." The Solomons deepened the nightmare. Guadalcanal was a fight not just for territory but for survival, and the Warhawk was there in numbers. Alongside Wildcats and the newer Corsairs, it tore into bomber raids, pouncing on formations before they could strike Henderson Field. Japanese prisoners admitted they once laughed at the shark mouths, now they feared them in their dreams. One recalled seeing them through smoke and cloud, mouths wide, guns flashing, and knowing at that instant he would not return home. The psychological toll was as great as the physical. Pilots who entered the war with grins and boasting now flew with resignation etched into their faces. Even before combat began, some believed the day would end in fire. The Warhawk was carving not only enemy wings but enemy spirit. Accounts from Allied pilots reveal the shift clearly. One Australian recalled dueling a Zero near Port Moresby. The Japanese flyer tried to wheel into a tight turn, confident he could outmaneuver. But the Warhawk simply rolled into a dive and the Zero followed. At first it seemed the Zero might hold, then its wings trembled, the frame shook, and the pilot panicked. That was the moment the Australian fired, and the Zero vanished in flame. Afterward he admitted he almost pitied the man, but only almost. For by then pity had no place in a sky where survival belonged to the machine that could take punishment and still strike back. By late 1942 into 1943, the transformation was unmistakable. The Warhawk was no longer the butt of jokes. It had become a warning whispered in Japanese camps, a presence that weighed on minds before missions began. Reports spoke not of contempt but of caution. Do not follow the shark mouth, do not underestimate the dragon. Where once there was laughter, now there was silence broken only by engines warming for sorties many knew might be their last. The dragon that was mocked had become a nightmare, a predator stalking both the sky and the soul of those who faced it. By 1943 the laughter had long vanished, replaced by tight lips and eyes that scanned the horizon with dread. In the steaming jungles of New Guinea, Japanese squadrons entered the fight already burdened with losses, their replacements younger, less trained, but still fed on tales of Zero invincibility. Yet every sortie brought them face to face with the reality that the clumsy dragon they once mocked had become the reaper of their comrades. Missions over WWII and WWII turned into gauntlets. Warhawks rose from the mist, diving with shrieking fury, and unleashed storms of lead that shredded fragile frames. Soldiers on the ground described flaming wreckage falling through canopy like meteors, the jungle swallowing metal and flesh alike. For Japanese flyers, every cloud could hide a mouth of painted teeth, every shadow a hunter poised to strike. At Port Moresby the pattern intensified. Veteran Allied pilots had perfected the art of vertical warfare. They never offered the Zero a turning contest. Instead they stalked from above, pounced, fired, and pulled away. Japanese units lost aces in single bursts, men who had once been celebrated as invincible. A diary recovered from a wrecked Zero told of despair. The dragon falls faster than we can follow. Its teeth spit endless fire. I see them when I close my eyes. Such words revealed not just tactical defeat but psychological collapse. The Zero was still agile, still graceful, but grace could not stop a torrent of .50 caliber slugs tearing through tanks and wings. The Solomon Islands campaign deepened the scar. Guadalcanal had already proved that Japanese momentum could be broken, and as the fighting spread through the chain, Warhawks joined the hammering raids that tore into supply lines and convoys. In coordinated strikes with bombers and other fighters, the Warhawk became the escort and the predator. Japanese crews reported dreading its silhouette more than newer types, because they knew what its guns would do. One prisoner admitted, "We feared the shark mouths more than the others. The Corsair was faster, the Lightning more dangerous, but the Dragon always came down like thunder. It never let us breathe." The irony was bitter. The very plane they once dismissed as second-rate had become the specter haunting their missions. In Burma the Warhawk wrote another chapter. During the Allied push to reclaim lost ground in 1943, squadrons strafed convoys, shredded columns on jungle roads, and intercepted bombers desperate to hold territory. Here the Warhawk's durability proved decisive. Even when riddled with bullets, it could limp back to base, patched and flown again within days. Japanese aircraft rarely enjoyed such resilience. Mechanics salvaged what they could from wrecks, but the attrition bled them dry. For the pilots, every encounter carried the weight of inevitability. They no longer flew expecting to dominate. They flew hoping to survive. Reports from Allied pilots reflected the shift in balance. One remembered engaging a formation of Zeros that broke apart almost immediately. "They would not commit," he said. "They turned away at the first pass. We hit them and they scattered." The fight was over before it began. That hesitation was lethal. Once Japanese pilots hesitated, the Warhawk pounced without mercy. Combat became execution. By late 1943 the fear had crystallized into doctrine. In Japanese training manuals the warning appeared clearly: never follow the shark mouth in a dive, avoid prolonged encounters, strike only if advantage is certain. Such instructions revealed a truth: the predator had reversed. The Zero, once hunter, now played the role of hunted whenever the Warhawk appeared. What had begun as a laugh in 1941 was now a grim mantra: beware the dragon. And still the Warhawk endured. It lacked the glamour of newer machines, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Its presence in the sky was a constant reminder that arrogance had burned away, replaced by smoke trails and falling wrecks. By 1944, the Japanese faced a nightmare of their own making, a plane they once considered unworthy now etched into their fear with every sortie, every mission, every lost comrade. The transformation was nearly complete. By 1944 the Warhawk was no longer an underdog story whispered in tents or villages, it was an omnipresent fact of war. In Burma the Allied counteroffensives surged forward, and with them came the shark-mouthed fighters that had once been dismissed as clumsy relics. They swept down on Japanese supply columns winding through jungle tracks, tore into bridges and depots, and cut arteries that held armies together. Japanese troops began to fear the sky itself, for every time the deep growl of an Allison engine echoed through the canopy, men scattered in terror, knowing that heavy machine gun fire would rake their positions. Pilots in the air fared no better. Once proud squadrons entered combat already burdened by losses and dwindling morale. They had been told to avoid the Warhawk's dive, yet in the chaos of battle instinct overrode training, and another Zero would follow, wings trembling, frame breaking apart, fire trailing behind into the green jungle below. In the Philippines the pattern repeated. The Japanese sought desperately to hold ground, but the skies were contested fiercely, and Warhawks remained in the thick of the fight. They were not the newest machines in the Allied arsenal, overshadowed by Corsairs and Mustangs, but they were relentless. Against Japanese aircraft that had barely evolved since 1941, the P-40 remained lethal. Its guns chewed through interceptors, its dives tore bombers apart, and its presence reminded every Japanese crewman that the Empire's time was running short. Prisoners taken in these battles spoke with resignation. One pilot admitted, "We once called them heavy, slow, foolish. Now when I see the teeth I feel only dread. I know their fire will find me." It was no longer mockery, it was confession. On the ground, civilians under occupation began to view the Warhawk as a herald. In Burmese villages, children who once feared every airplane began pointing to shark mouths as signs of liberation. Reports tell of people cheering when they saw them streak low across valleys, the painted teeth grinning like symbols of vengeance. For the Japanese this shift was devastating. Their propaganda had painted them as masters of the air, yet reality painted something else. Fire, wreckage, and the sound of Warhawks carving through formations that had once flown unchallenged. By 1945, with the empire collapsing, Japanese air groups were shadows of their former selves. Fuel was scarce, pilots were poorly trained, aircraft were outdated. Against this backdrop the Warhawk still flew, battered yet enduring, the same rugged machine that had first been laughed at in 1941. Now it was a specter of inevitability. Each encounter was one-sided. The Zero had begun the war as the embodiment of Japanese superiority, it ended as a fragile coffin in the sky. The Warhawk had begun as a joke, it ended as a nightmare etched into every pilot who ever faced it. Diaries captured after the war carried bitter reflections. One line stands out, "The dragon with painted teeth was our doom. We mocked it and it killed us." The final irony is that the P-40 was never the best fighter of the war. It was outclassed in speed, in altitude, in maneuverability by machines that came after. Yet none carried the same transformation in reputation. None traveled from laughter to terror so vividly. For the Japanese, the Warhawk embodied their downfall, not because it was perfect but because it was relentless. It fought with what it had, and what it had was enough to turn arrogance into despair. Its shark mouth became more than paint. It became prophecy, the grin of a predator that never let go once it struck. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Warhawk story closed not with glory parades or monuments, but with the quiet truth that it had done its job. It had defended, it had punished, and it had haunted. In the memories of Japanese pilots, it remained the clumsy dragon that proved fatal, the symbol of a war they began with laughter and ended in flames. And in that silence, in the burned-out airfields and shattered cockpits, the echo of their arrogance lingered, answered forever by the roar of an American machine they once dismissed and never forgot. The roots of Japanese contempt for the Warhawk lay in the aura of invincibility the Zero had built during the early campaigns. In 1940 and 1941, when Japan surged across China and the Pacific, the Zero carved through opposition with startling ease. Against Soviet-built I-15s and I-16s in China, against the lumbering Brewsters and Buffaloes of Southeast Asia, it had danced circles, climbing higher, turning tighter, and striking with the precision of a fencer. Pilots returned from sorties with victory counts that seemed impossible, entire squadrons shattered in minutes. Newspapers hailed the Zero as the master of the skies, and propaganda fed a narrative of untouchable supremacy. It was within this climate that the Warhawk appeared, heavy and blunt, its nose painted with teeth that invited ridicule. To the Japanese it looked like desperation disguised as ferocity. They believed no amount of paint could mask its deficiencies, no American engineering could rival the elegance of their fighter, born of lightweight design and a doctrine built on speed and maneuver. Their laughter was the laughter of men who had never yet been challenged. But hidden within that arrogance were cracks. The very qualities that gave the Zero its dominance, its stripped-down weight, its lack of armor, its unsealed fuel tanks, were vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. The Warhawk, though derided as clumsy, carried what the Zero lacked: protection, resilience, and firepower. Its Allison engine, though less nimble, could dive faster and survive damage that would tear a Zero apart. Its skin could take hits that would rip through Japanese fuselages like paper. Most of all, its 6 heavy Browning machine guns concentrated more fire than any Japanese pilot had ever faced. To men accustomed to duels decided by a few light cannon shells or bursts of rifle-caliber fire, the storm unleashed by a Warhawk was overwhelming. In the space of a heartbeat, a Zero could be engulfed, its fuel erupting, its frame unraveling. The context of Japanese confidence cannot be ignored. When they faced China's Air Force, they faced outdated machines and poorly trained pilots. When they struck Malaya and the Philippines, their opponents flew aircraft that were underpowered, underarmed, or flown by men taken by surprise. Success came so swiftly that it fed the illusion of inherent superiority, the belief that Japanese skill and Japanese machines were beyond contest. Into this illusion walked the P-40. It was not the most advanced of American designs, not the pinnacle of technology, but it was solid. Where others crumbled, it endured. Where others spun away, it held course. And when it struck with thunder. As the battles mounted, Japanese pilots began to feel the weight of their mistake. They discovered that mockery had no value when faced with firepower that could erase them in seconds. They realized that agility meant little when the enemy refused to play by their rules, when instead of turning contests they faced vertical slashes, dives so fast they dared not follow. They learned that resilience mattered more than grace, that surviving to fight again was the true measure of a war machine. Each wrecked Zero, each fallen comrade, chipped away at the myth of invincibility, replacing laughter with doubt, doubt with fear, and fear with despair. By the time 1943 had turned to 1944, the psychological balance had reversed. The Warhawk was no longer simply an enemy aircraft, it was the embodiment of their misjudgment. It stood as proof that arrogance is a liability, that underestimating an opponent invites disaster. Its shark mouth, once mocked, became a symbol of the nightmare that stalked them from Burma to the Philippines. In every roar of its engine they heard the collapse of their certainty. In every burst of its guns they saw the punishment of their pride. The Warhawk had not only killed their comrades, it had killed their illusion. The Warhawk's transformation from laughingstock to predator was not only a matter of tactics or courage, but of engineering hidden beneath its rugged skin. Japanese pilots mocked its bulk without understanding what that bulk carried. The Zero weighed less, turned tighter, climbed more quickly, but in pursuit of elegance it had been stripped bare. The P-40, by contrast, was forged as a machine meant to endure. Its Allison V1710 engine was not the most powerful, but it delivered steady thrust across medium altitudes, and more crucially it tolerated abuse. Pilots discovered they could push the throttle, dive at speeds above 400 miles per hour, and the Warhawk would not disintegrate. The Zero trembled when forced beyond 350, its wings quivering, its skin threatening to peel away. That difference was invisible on paper yet brutal in combat. The numbers told a story Japanese arrogance refused to hear. In raw speed the Warhawk at low altitude often matched or surpassed the Zero, touching nearly 360 miles per hour when the Japanese machine struggled to keep pace beyond 330. In a dive the margin widened fatally. A Zero forced downward could not recover if it followed too far. Its control surfaces stiffened, its light frame screamed in protest, and many a pilot felt his machine shudder into chaos. The Warhawk, heavier and sturdier, drove downward like an iron spear, and at the bottom of that dive waited 6 Browning M2 heavy machine guns. Each one spat rounds at a rate that dwarfed the twin cannon and twin machine gun armament of the Zero. In the time it took a Zero to pepper an opponent with rifle-caliber bursts, the Warhawk could pour streams of lead that tore through armor, fuel tanks and wings. Pilots quickly learned what the numbers meant in flesh and fire. A Japanese airman who once boasted that he could dance around any American machine found his Zero riddled in a heartbeat, the heavy slugs igniting his fuel before he could even roll away. Survivors admitted later that the first time they saw the volume of fire from a P-40 they froze. It was not a duel of maneuvers. It was a storm, a roar of destruction that felt impossible to outfly. One described it bitterly as, like standing before a waterfall of fire. Even endurance mattered. The Zero's designers had sacrificed armor to chase agility. Its fuel tanks lacked self-sealing protection, so even a single incendiary round could turn the fighter into a comet. The Warhawk carried armor plating to shield its pilot, heavier skin around vital systems, and self-sealing tanks that often let it limp home despite damage. Ground crews patched bullet holes and sent it back into the sky within days. Japanese mechanics, by contrast, often wrote reports of machines lost entirely after a single engagement. The difference was not glamorous, but it was decisive. In war, surviving to fly again meant building momentum. Dying in flames meant attrition the Empire could not afford. The cockpit told its own tale. Allied pilots spoke of instruments that, while crowded, gave them clarity at high speeds. The Warhawk's controls grew heavy but remained reliable even as the aircraft dove. Japanese flyers were accustomed to delicate touch, to frames that obeyed with fingertip precision, but they discovered too late that such delicacy could betray them when stress mounted. The Zero rewarded grace, the Warhawk rewarded ruthlessness. In direct comparison, the Zero had a tighter turn radius, able to outcircle nearly any foe. But that circle became a trap once Warhawk pilots refused to enter it. Instead they fought vertically, exploiting every ounce of sturdiness. P-40 diving from altitude could build momentum a Zero could not counter. In effect, one fighter was a dancer, the other a brawler. Early Japanese arrogance came from believing that dance always wins. The war revealed otherwise. When the brawler lands a single devastating punch, the dance ends in silence. The shift in perception was gradual but relentless. Pilots who laughed at the shark mouth nose art soon realized that those teeth symbolized more than paint. They were a warning of the destructive force concentrated in the Warhawk's frame. They were the visible echo of its 6 Brownings, of its ability to endure punishment and return to strike again. They were the grin of inevitability, sharpened not by elegance but by engineering choices that favored survival over style. Yet the Warhawk's reputation did not rest on paper comparisons alone. In the skies its strengths unfolded in ways that made Japanese pilots feel trapped in contests they had once believed were theirs to dominate. At medium altitudes, where most Pacific dogfights unfolded, the Warhawk could fight on equal terms. Its cruising speed, close to 340 miles per hour, meant it could dictate the moment of engagement, and its acceleration in a dive gave it the initiative to break away or strike at will. Against a Zero, the Warhawk could not pirouette, but it could choose the fight, and choice was everything. When compared to European contemporaries, the Warhawk seemed modest. The Spitfire boasted superior climb and agility, the Mustang soared faster and higher with greater range, yet in the early Pacific those machines were scarce. The Warhawk was present, rugged and willing. It carried the burden of battles others could not yet reach. And in those battles, its supposed deficiencies became advantages. In the thick, humid air over Burma and New Guinea, where engagements began low and ended lower, the Warhawk thrived. Spitfires designed for European skies lost some of their grace, but the Warhawk, with its sturdy wings and reliable engine, fought exactly as intended, like a blunt instrument smashing through fragile opponents. Japanese flyers confronted this paradox daily. They knew their Zero could still outturn any opponent, but the Warhawk's firepower denied them the luxury of prolonged duels. A Zero that lingered too long risked annihilation in an instant. To counter the threat, they tried ambushes, diving first, but even here the Warhawk proved resilient. Armor plating shielded its pilots where the Zero offered nothing. Many Japanese pilots perished not because they lacked skill, but because their machines gave them no margin for error. An American pilot might return with holes in his fuselage and scars in his skin, while his Japanese counterpart returned in ashes, or not at all. The contrast in armament could not be overstated. Two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns on a Zero packed a sting, but ammunition was limited, and bursts had to be carefully rationed. 6 heavy Brownings on a Warhawk could fire longer, wider streams, saturating the sky in lead. In a clash of fleeting seconds, that difference was decisive. Japanese accounts spoke of the horror of flying into a wall of fire, of watching tracer after tracer march relentlessly across their wings until flames consumed them. What once had seemed a lumbering beast had revealed itself as a predator with claws that tore without hesitation. As newer Allied fighters arrived, the Mustang with its breathtaking range, the Thunderbolt with its brute power, the Warhawk's role diminished in headlines but not in effect. For Japanese pilots, it remained a constant. They could rationalize losses to Mustangs as defeats by a superior generation, but losses to Warhawks cut deeper. This was the machine they had ridiculed, the one they had called obsolete, and still it killed them. Each encounter was a reminder of their arrogance, each burst of fire a punishment for laughter once uttered. That psychological weight grew heavier than steel. By 1944, when the Allies pressed across Burma and toward the Philippines, the Warhawk had become part of the rhythm of defeat. Reports no longer mocked it, they begged for ways to avoid it. Commanders warned their men not to engage unless advantage was certain, yet certainty had long evaporated. The Zero could still climb like a phantom, but what use was ascent when the Warhawk fell like an avalanche? Pilots described hearing its guns before they saw its teeth, and in that instant they knew the fight was already lost. Technical comparisons made after the war confirmed what combat had already proven. The Warhawk's sturdiness, firepower, and ability to dive faster than nearly any contemporary aircraft gave it tools the Zero could never match. Japanese engineers had chosen grace over armor, speed of turn over survival, and for a time that gamble brought triumph. But war is not a single duel. War is repetition, attrition, the wearing down of men and machines. In that arena, the Warhawk was superior. It was not elegant, but it endured, and endurance in war becomes inevitability. Thus the machine that arrived to jeers and ridicule ended as a symbol of dread. Its shark mouth, once dismissed as bravado, became an omen. Its guns, once doubted, became executioners. And its very existence reminded Japanese pilots of a truth they had tried to ignore, that arrogance in the face of steel is as fragile as paper wings. The Warhawk did not need to be perfect. It needed only to be enough, and in every dive, every burst, every burning wreck, it was. The story of the Warhawk's rise cannot be told without dwelling on the blindness of its enemies. For the Japanese, arrogance was not a flaw at the margins. It was woven into the very fabric of their air doctrine. In the first months of the war, they believed themselves heirs to the samurai of the sky, their Zero's invincible blades cutting through clouds with divine ease. Against Chinese biplanes and outdated American exports, they had reaped easy harvests, and in victory they mistook weakness in their opponents for superiority in themselves. When the Warhawk appeared, heavy, blunt, its nose painted with teeth that looked more like a circus act than a weapon, they laughed. Of course they laughed. Why not, when the world had been telling them they were invincible? To their eyes it was a flying coffin, a desperate gesture by a nation unprepared. The irony is that those same teeth they mocked would become the last thing many of them ever saw. Their mistake was not simply technical, it was psychological. They worshipped maneuver, the elegant turn, the graceful climb, convinced that aerial combat was an art form in which their Zero was a brush and the sky a canvas. But combat is not a painting, it is a demolition. The Warhawk was not graceful, but it was relentless. It did not dance, it mauled. And yet Japanese pilots, steeped in the belief that artistry always triumphs, continued to wheel into duels as if their enemy would politely join the waltz. Instead the Warhawk dove through them, guns blazing, and left their canvases smeared with smoke. The comedy writes itself, masters of the sky undone by their own obsession with elegance, sneering at a beast that did not play their game and therefore always won. The numbers had been there all along. Anyone willing to measure rather than boast could have seen them. The Zero turned tighter, yes, but the Warhawk was faster in a dive, sturdier under fire, armed with a wall of lead no paper-skinned fighter could withstand. But arrogance blinds. Japanese commanders briefed their men with confidence that bordered on fantasy. The enemy machine is slow, it cannot climb, it will fall easily, they said. And their pilots believed it because believing was easier than adapting. Then they went up, laughed at the shark teeth and vanished in fire. Again and again until even their diaries reeked not of confidence but of despair. The contrast with Allied thinking is almost cruel. American and Commonwealth pilots knew the Warhawk was not the best fighter in the world. They knew it lacked grace. They adapted their tactics to fit its strengths, turned its supposed weaknesses into advantages, and used it ruthlessly. The Japanese, by contrast, clung to illusions of supremacy. They believed their turn radius would always save them, their training always outshine. In clinging to that pride, they walked willingly into a slaughter. One might almost pity them, if their arrogance had not been so insufferable, if their laughter had not preceded so many raids on helpless cities. But pity has little room in war, and the Warhawk returned their sneers with bursts of fire that erased them from the sky. It is tempting to imagine an alternate history in which Japanese commanders took the Warhawk seriously from the start, adjusted tactics, reinforced their fragile machines with armor, trained their pilots to respect rather than mock. Perhaps the toll would have been lighter, the fear less crushing. But they did not. They doubled down on contempt, clung to superiority as if it were armor, and discovered too late that arrogance offers no protection when 6 Brownings open fire. Their mistake was not just a technical misjudgment, it was a cultural flaw. In believing themselves chosen, they blinded themselves to the strengths of an enemy they dismissed. And so the Warhawk became not only their opponent but their punishment, the embodiment of consequences they refused to imagine. By the time the tide had turned irreversibly, their laughter had curdled into silence. Briefing rooms once filled with jokes about shark mouths became heavy with warnings. Do not chase in a dive, do not underestimate, do not laugh. It was too late. The Warhawk had already carved its legend across Burma, New Guinea, the Solomons, the Philippines. Their arrogance had written the script, and the Warhawk had delivered the final act. In the end, their laughter was not just silenced, it was mocked by history itself, remembered as the hubris of men who mistook fragile grace for invincibility and learned the lesson in fire. By the time the Warhawk's legend had hardened into fact, its appearance in the sky carried an impact far beyond the reach of its guns. For Japanese pilots, the sight of shark teeth painted on a Warhawk's nose was no longer a curiosity but a sentence. Accounts taken after the war reveal a chilling consistency. Men who once scoffed at the aircraft now spoke of dread settling in their stomachs the moment they saw its silhouette. Even before the first burst of fire, morale had already cracked. One prisoner admitted, "When we saw the shark mouth, our hearts sank. We already imagined the fire that would follow." This was the essence of psychological warfare, an aircraft that imposed fear before it struck. The ripple of that fear spread outward. In Burma, Japanese ground troops scattered at the sound of an approaching engine, knowing that strafing runs could rain down at any moment. In New Guinea, soldiers wrote that they could no longer sleep when the sky was clear, convinced that Warhawks prowled overhead. Civilians under occupation began to recognize the aircraft not as a threat but as a promise, cheering when they saw its profile. For the Japanese, the machine they mocked had become a harbinger of defeat, and each roar of its Allison engine reminded them that their supremacy was gone. The panic was not limited to Japan. In North Africa, German and Italian pilots encountered the same blunt force and came away humbled. The Warhawk was not the machine they feared most. Messerschmitt pilots learned to respect the Spitfire and later the Mustang, but it was the one that embarrassed them most. It was supposed to be inferior, the export toy of an unprepared nation. And yet it chewed through convoys, shredded bombers, and outlasted punishment that would have destroyed sleeker rivals. For Rommel's men in the desert, the sight of Kitty Hawks diving with guns blazing became synonymous with defeat. They whispered bitterly of the American Hammer, a machine they had been told would be easy prey but which became a relentless predator. For the Japanese, the humiliation cut deeper. The Zero had been built up not only as a fighter but as a symbol of national genius, the embodiment of a warrior spirit that could not be touched. When the Warhawk shredded that illusion, it was not just aircraft that fell but identity. Diaries show the transition with painful clarity. Early entries boasting of easy kills, later ones filled with warnings and finally despair. "The dragon comes again," one pilot wrote in 1944, "and our men burn before they can laugh." The transformation of laughter into silence, of mockery into mourning, revealed the collapse of a myth. This fear had lasting consequences in the way battles unfolded. Pilots who doubted their machines hesitated in combat, and hesitation was fatal. Zeros broke away sooner, formations scattered more quickly, and the once disciplined aggression of Japanese air groups dissolved into fractured responses. Allied pilots noted it with astonishment. What had been fierce and coordinated in 1941 became tentative by 1943, panicked by 1944. The Warhawk had not done this alone. Other aircraft and shifting tides of war played their part, but it symbolized the turning. Its heavy guns and shark teeth were reminders that even the most confident empire could be undone by the machine it once laughed at. Beyond the battlefield, the Warhawk shaped strategy. Its ruggedness and reliability allowed commanders to commit it to missions that might have grounded more delicate fighters. It escorted bombers over jungles, strafed supply lines, defended cities under siege. Each appearance reinforced its reputation. Japanese intelligence reports began to exaggerate its presence, inflating numbers because fear magnified every sighting. Pilots claimed to see Warhawks in the sky even when other Allied fighters were present, a testament to the grip it held on their imagination. For them, the Warhawk was not just an aircraft but a symbol of inevitability, the shadow of defeat flying above them. The psychological scar lingered long after the war ended. Japanese veterans spoke of nightmares in which they heard the heavy roar of its engine, the rattle of its guns. German and Italian flyers, too, admitted grudging respect, though tinged with embarrassment that they had once dismissed it. In military studies that followed, analysts pointed to the P-40 as proof that resilience and firepower could outweigh elegance, that contempt for an opponent is a weapon turned against oneself. It was not the fastest or the most glamorous aircraft, yet it left behind a deeper mark than many of its sleeker peers. And so the Warhawk's long shadow stretched beyond 1945. In every lecture hall where air cadets study the rise and fall of empires, its story is retold, the machine that was laughed at until the laughter died in fire. In every retelling, the irony sharpens. Japan's arrogance forged its myth of invincibility, and the Warhawk shattered it not with brilliance but with brute certainty. That lesson lingers as the truest legacy. To underestimate is to invite ruin, to laugh at a predator is to feed it. And in the end, the P-40 Warhawk devoured the pride of a nation that believed itself untouchable. History has many ways of punishing arrogance, but few are as vivid as the fate of the Zero when it met the Warhawk. What began with laughter ended with silence, and in between lay years of fire and falling wreckage. The Japanese believed their fighter untouchable, their pilots unbeatable, their supremacy unquestioned. They mocked the painted shark mouths, scoffed at the weight of the machine, called it slow, clumsy, doomed. Yet the only doom written was their own. The Warhawk did not need to be perfect. It needed only to be relentless, and relentless it was. From Kunming to Rangoon, from New Guinea to the Philippines, the same story played out. The dragon they mocked appeared in the sky, opened its teeth and erased them. For every Zero lost, for every bomber torn apart, the illusion of invincibility cracked further until nothing remained but fear. In the end, Japanese airmen did not fight the Warhawk so much as they fled from it, dreading its shadow before the first shot was fired. Their arrogance became their epitaph, carved not in stone but in smoke and fire. The lesson is universal. In war, contempt is as fatal as any bullet. Underestimating an opponent transforms confidence into weakness, pride into a trap. The P-40 Warhawk stands as a monument to that truth. It was not the best, not the fastest, not the most graceful, but it was enough. And enough, when wielded with resilience, becomes decisive. Its shark mouth grinned through history, mocking the mockers, reminding us all that victory belongs not to those who laugh first, but to those who endure last. And that is why its story endures. Not simply as a tale of steel and fire, but as a warning. To every pilot who sneers at an enemy, to every strategist who dismisses a threat, to every empire convinced of its invincibility, the Warhawk whispers from the past, beware. Arrogance burns. If you have flown with us through this journey, seen the laughter, the fire, the fall, then you know history is never just dates and numbers. It is a living drama written in human pride and human cost. And if you want more stories like this, stories that bring history to life in the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, ring the bell, and join us as we uncover the lessons etched in steel and smoke. Because every story has a hook and every hook has teeth,